Now today we have Sandy Mader, one of our great researchers here at the Cumberland County Historical Society, and she's going to present From Slavery to Integration, Education as a Road to Opportunity. Let's all give her a nice warm welcome. One more thing I forgot. HistoricalSociety.com. All of our programs are going to be online, and if you go under program, you can click on, I think it's called past programs, and you can watch, if somebody was not able to see the program, they can click on that and watch it, okay? Right now I think we only have one on, but they all will be going on our website. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Now, I tested before, although I wasn't standing right here. Rob, can you hear me? Okay, great. Harriet can hear me too, fantastic. I'd like to be able to avoid using the microphone, primarily because I just put my own hearing aids in, and if I use the microphone, then I hear myself way better than I really want to. So as long as you can hear me too, that's all that's really important. I'd like to thank you very much for coming, and I want to take advantage of this first opportunity just to take care of a few administrative details, or as the military says, admin details. Linda mentioned that Randy Watts will be doing a presentation next week about historic fire companies. So that gives me a perfect opportunity to tell you that the emergency exit, the fire exit, if you should happen to need it, is that door right back there. The door that you came in is also available naturally, but in an emergency, the fire exit is at the back, my left of the room. I'd also like to ask, how many of you took advantage of the opportunity to park in the parking lot of the church across from the street? May I see some hands? Oh, that's wonderful, because I want to give them a call and thank them for making that available to us, because I think that has been a big benefit. I'd also like to say that I specifically wore this shirt in the hopes that we won't have any more snow. I want to put this shirt, as much as I love it, away for the winter, okay? So fingers crossed. And even though I'm the one who's doing the talking today, and therefore I take the blame for any mistakes that come out of my mouth, I am not the only one who has provided the research and the support that has gone into this presentation. On the screen, you can see a brief information about the members of the committee. We're lucky enough to have 1, 2, 3 members of the committee with us today. And Ruth and Janet and Jane, if you would stand up so that you can be recognized, I would appreciate it. Steve Berg couldn't come, and I don't see Stephanie or Janet. Am I just not looking in the right places? Okay, all right. I wanted to just make another brief announcement. I talked to Mayor Tim Scott on Sunday, and he told me that he was sorry that he wasn't going to be able to be here, but he sent his mother to represent the family. I now know that he sent his mother and an aunt to represent the family. So if the two of you would stand up just briefly and acknowledge our thanks, I would appreciate it. We're all aware that language changes over time. As I present this talk, there are going to be words used in historic contexts that we would not use today. I'm aware of that. You're going to be aware of that. I hope that it doesn't affect anyone in a negative sort of way. I'd also like to say that when this project was first envisioned, the idea was that we were going to talk about African American history in the entire county. Because obviously we are the Cumberland County Historical Society. We are not just the Carlile Historical Society. It quickly became apparent that we had way, way, way too much information available to us to even do a presentation that does more than scratch the surface of the history of the community in Carlile. So this is a focused, an attempt to focus on African American families and institutions in Carlile, not in the broader sense of the entire county, but we have decided and agreed that we are going to do more presentations in the future. So keep your eyes and ears open so that you can find out about other presentations that we do in the future. Stephanie Gerard, who is a member of our committee, just came in. Thank you very much for coming, Stephanie. Okay. There will be a time for questions and comments at the end. I would appreciate it if you would wait until the end so that you don't interrupt the fragile flow of the thoughts that go through my brain. Thank you very much. Oh yes, and I'm supposed to use this little thing. I'm not a creature of the 21st century, as you can tell. There we go. Okay. Almost exactly 2 years ago, I had just finished the presentation that I did here about Millicent Kitzmiller. I was very happy to have done that presentation, and I started very briefly thinking about what the next presentation I might want to do might be about. The spring of 2013 was also a time when there was a lot of commentary in the newspapers and in the Historical Society itself about the fact that we were approaching the sesquicentennial of the Battle of Gettysburg. There was also a project underway to do research related to the United States colored troops, specifically research about why there are no names of United States colored troop veterans on the memorial at the square here in Carlile. That project, by the way, is ongoing. The answers to those questions have not all been determined. And I became interested in information that I was hearing and reading and meetings that I was attending related to the hallowed ground projects. Specifically, I became more aware of Lincoln Cemetery here in Carlile. And let me just tell you that the history of Lincoln Cemetery could be an entire presentation in and of itself. I became more interested in the Shippensburg African American Cemetery, Locust Grove. So I was thinking in terms of African American cemeteries too. And then, in the fall of 2013, my dear husband came home from a Parks and Recreation Board meeting. My husband, Jim Mader, is fairly well known in the community because of his work with the YMCA and his volunteer work with the Cumberland Valley Rail Trail and the Parks and Recreation Committee, et cetera, et cetera. If you know my husband, Jim, you know he has a wonderful sense of humor. So it will not surprise you when I relay this anecdote. It was the fall of 2013, and Jim came home from a Parks and Recreation Committee meeting, and they had been talking about a playground that was being developed on Chestnut Avenue by a group called the South of South Neighborhood Association, SOSO. And they had been talking about the fact that this was being called the Butcher Family Tot Lot. But at the Parks and Recreation Committee meeting, nobody there knew anything about the Butcher family. And Jim said to me, "It's a shame I don't know a volunteer at the Historical Society who might do a little bit of research for me so that I could report about this family." Now, at that particular point in time, I was up to here in commitments and research related to the Millbrook. And I really did not have to take on, I didn't have the energy to take on a research commitment for my husband. But I was here the next day, and I did just a moment's worth of research on the Butcher family, and found out that they were an African American family. I was already thinking about African American history. I found out that they lived on Walnut Street, which is just a block and a half away from the YMCA. I spend a lot of time at the YMCA. I found out that they lived on one of our main streets, Walnut Street, not one of the alleys. And I had been told since I first started volunteering here at the Historical Society that African American families in Carlile tended to live in the, what you all call avenues, and what I would call alleys, the streets in between the main streets, Church Avenue, Dickinson Avenue, Chapel Avenue, et cetera, Chestnut Avenue. So here was an African American family that lived on Walnut Street. I thought, this is just fantastic. I've got to do more research. Fortunately, the committee came into being at about that same time, and Jane Black, bless her heart, took the bit in her teeth and ran with the Butcher family history research. And so most of what I'm going to tell you about the Butcher family comes from Jane's research. The photo on the screen right now is of the dedication of the Butcher family tot lot that took place in December of 2013. And it looked a lot then like it looks right now, but we're all hoping for spring to come soon. And this shows a picture of John and Charlotte Butcher. They are the family that I'm focusing on in great detail today, especially with regards to the subtitle of my talk, which is Education as a Road to Opportunity. Because education was incredibly important to this family, as you'll find out as we continue forward in the presentation. I want to mention to you now, and I'll refer again throughout the presentation, to something called the Pennsylvania Negro Business Directory Illustrated of 1910. Early on in my research, I was doing a keyword research here in the library of the Historical Society, and I found a reference to that booklet. This booklet, which says Black History of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, is a reprint and a rebinding of that same booklet that is mentioned there, the Pennsylvania Negro Business Directory of 1910. This rebinding was done by the Byers family in 1977, and it is just a fantastic resource. As I said to you, I'm going to be referring to this often. This slim volume has an incredible amount of historical information in it. For instance, in addition to giving a county-by-county snapshot of African American life in the state of Pennsylvania, complete with population figures, schools, etc., the book also includes ads from African American owned businesses at that time, as well as profiles of prominent African American citizens, like John Butcher. And the photo of John Butcher comes from that directory. The photo of Charlotte Butcher comes from Charles Franklin Moss's studio, and I'm going to talk more about Charles Franklin Moss in a few minutes. And when I did the preliminary presentation for our committee group, John Black told me that it's really annoying to people when a speaker says they are going to refer to something later and then they don't. Trust me, I'm going to refer to Charles Franklin Moss in some detail later, so you don't need to worry about that. But let me read just a little bit to you about John Butcher from that directory. John J. Butcher has been a resident of Carlile for 45 years, during which time he has always been looked upon as one of its leading citizens. Mr. Butcher has practically retired from business, but his guiding hand is to be seen in the enterprise that is carried on by his children. Two of his children are in college, one at Howard University and one at Hampton, Virginia. One daughter teaches in the public school in Carlisle. His son John, upon a plot of 3.5 acres of land just outside the town's limit, is successfully engaged in the raising of hogs. Mr. Butcher owns several paying properties and his home, situated upon one of the nicest residence streets of the town. It is a model of comfort to his declining years. Now, I'm going to refer shortly to the fact that the Butcher family lived on Walnut Street for 49 years, which means had the South of South neighborhood organization existed at the time that they were living there, they could have been so-so members. I also want to just read just a little bit about Mr. Butcher from his obituary, which was in the newspaper in 1919. At that time, he was 87 years old, and it states that he was born 5 miles from Winchester, Virginia, and together with his parents and other children, was sold into slavery. After the Emancipation Proclamation and during the Battle of Gettysburg, John Butcher and his wife came to this county, and after residing in the county for a time, moved to Carlile. For about 25 years, Mr. Butcher was a faithful employee of the late George Hench of South Hanover Street. Then another interesting newspaper article from 1890, this was obviously before Mr. Butcher died, under a headline that reads, "After many years," that's the headline, "after many years." Then it states, "A slave owner and a slave once owned by him met in Carlile on Wednesday after 25 years separation and enjoyed the unexpected meeting very much. The slave was John Butcher, the colored man who resides on Walnut Street, and his former master was Joseph Barton, who lives near Winchester and who was here to visit his son. The two men accidentally met and recognized each other, and they were glad to meet once more after these many years." And I'm still quoting. "The scene of the meeting is said to have been very interesting." Now, I just want to take a moment here to say that the word interesting can have a lot of different kinds of connotations. It doesn't always have to be interesting in a good way. And I can't speak for Mr. Butcher, but if I had been meeting the man who had thought that he owned me for 25 years, I would not personally have been all that happy to see him. But that's just me. The photo of Charlotte Butcher and her obituary, she lived to be 98 years old. And at the time she died, 6 of her children were still living, survived her. She had grown up at Prospect Hill, which was a large plantation near Winchester, Virginia. I'm going to just briefly mention what came out in Mr. Butcher's obituary about his association with George Hench. George Hench, and now I'm quoting from Mr. Hench's obituary, and he died in 1892. He had been born in Perry County and resided there until 1874 when he came to Carlile. Mr. Hench was extensively engaged in the tanning business. Now, I didn't have any idea what tanning was when I first came to Carlile. If you don't know what the tanneries are, it's the process of changing raw hides into leather. It's a very labor-intensive, fairly nasty business, but Mr. Hench had a tannery in Perry County and possibly in Cumberland County as well. He has, his honorable methods of doing business have made him prominent over a good portion of southern Pennsylvania. He was a man greatly honored and respected in Perry and in Cumberland counties. Mr. Hench was a progressive citizen, very active in reforms in the town, and benevolent to the poor. Now, I want you to keep in mind that one of Charlotte and John's sons was named, and he was a pharmacist in D.C. after his college education. He was Dr. George Hench Butcher, obviously named after the man that Mr. Butcher had been engaged in business with for all those years. So I'm thinking that a couple don't name their son after a man unless they have a very fond association with him in a business sense or a personal sense. Now, if I'd had that microphone on, you would have just heard me gulp that glass of water. I sure am glad it wasn't nearly as loud as it could have been. This is a graph that shows some statistical information about the Gradual Abolition of Slavery Act. I have to digress for just a moment because I grew up in Southern Illinois, and as a young person, my total image of Pennsylvania revolved around the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia and the image that I thought was William Penn on the Quaker Oats package. I have since found out that that is not really William Penn on the Quaker Oats package. But, you know, what you think when you grow up sometimes continues into adulthood. Given the fact that I knew that Quakers had been dramatically involved in the founding of Pennsylvania, and thinking of the Liberty Bell, when I moved here in 2001 and found out that there had ever been slavery in Pennsylvania, I was absolutely astounded. And when I read the statistics and find out a little bit more about the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery, which was passed by the Pennsylvania Assembly in 1780, I'm even more surprised by it. I'm going to give you a little bit of background information about that act. It was the first such legislation in America, but it was not a dramatically strong piece of legislation. In fact, and I quote, it specified that every Negro and mulatto child born within the state after the passing of the act in 1780 would be free upon reaching the age of 28. So not only did it not free any or many slaves when it was passed in 1780, even children who were born into slavery after it passed remained in slavery until they reached the age of 78. I'm sorry, the age of 28. Yeah, that would be even a worse statistic. Basically, what this graph shows you is that the law freed very few slaves immediately. Between 1790 and 1800, the number of slaves in the state dropped from almost 4,000 to about 1,700. By 1810, there were just about 800 slaves in the state. In 1840, there were still 64 slaves in the state, and it wasn't until 1850 that the number of slaves in Pennsylvania had dropped to 0. I also want to mention just in very, very general terms something about the Underground Railroad, because the Underground Railroad was a significant part of the history of Cumberland County. And Janet Taylor did a presentation for us last year about the Underground Railroad and gave us a great deal of wonderful information. I want to briefly describe to you the geographic basis for the Underground Railroad coming into Cumberland County. I looked long and hard to find a map that I could use as a presentation on the screen. And every map I found online had a great deal of detail in terms of showing routes and paths and rivers and streams, and it was just, they were all just entirely too busy. So what I want you to do is visualize Winchester, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. The Shenandoah Valley continues north and becomes the Cumberland Valley. So we've got mountains like our North Mountain and South Mountain in Virginia forming the same kind of barrier to passage, with the beautiful valley in between the mountains. Pennsylvania is also, as you know, the first state north of the Mason-Dixon line. So slaves who were trying to escape could travel north on one of these routes, either along the rivers or along the railroads that were in existence then, from Virginia and into Pennsylvania, on further north to Canada or to the port city of Philadelphia. And the Cumberland County became a very well recognized route on the Underground Railroad. There were a number of well-known stations on the Underground Railroad in the county and in the valley. And Carlile itself, as part of that area, developed a reputation in the South that wasn't always laudatory, at least from the Southerners' point of view. And I'm going to read a quote to you from the Daily Richmond Enquirer from 1847. Now keep in mind that the Underground Railroad and abolitionist activities in this area were becoming increasingly well known in the Virginia area. And the newspaper quote that I'm quoting says, "Our Southern people should mark the town of Carlile and be especially careful that none of their sons shall be sent to that place for their education." So Dickinson College was acquiring a reputation within Southern communities as being possibly just a little bit too liberal for the purposes of those Southern parents. These two photographs, once again, come from the Pennsylvania Negro Business Directory of 1910. From now on, I'm just going to refer to it as the Directory of 1910, and when I do make those references, you'll know which reference I'm talking about. The picture on the left is Robert Thompson. Now, doing the math, since this booklet was published in 1910, and since Robert Thompson's father died in 1900, I'm assuming that this is a photograph of Robert Thompson Jr. And I'm going to read what it says about Robert Thompson Jr., and then I'm going to give you some more information about his father, because they were both very prominent men within the African American community. The 1910 directory says that Robert Thompson was a native of Carlile and a product of its public schools. Although limited in the respect of education, he stands as a businessman without peer in Pennsylvania. He is the largest individual property holder of the race in the state. He is a contractor and builder, having built 15 brick houses in 1908 and purchased 10. He owns 51 houses and 127 building lots. His houses are all kept in splendid condition. He employs from 10 to 12 hands, owns the burial ground for colored people of 15 acres, and has as tenants in his rental properties both white and colored. Now, the burial ground that is mentioned in that description refers to Union Cemetery in the northwest part of town. Mr. Thompson's father, whose obituary appears in the 1900 paper under the heading, "Carlile's most prominent colored citizen dies." And the obituary in this particular case, even though it runs a couple of paragraphs long, I believe is worth quoting. Because in my olden age, as I approach my olden age, I become more and more interested in obituaries. And a good obituary, an obituary that even though I didn't know the person, I feel like I have learned something about that person's personality. A good obituary always just makes me appreciate the effort that somebody went into writing it. So this is what it says about Mr. Thompson Sr. in 1900. The story of Robert Thompson's life, were it written in detail, would read like an interesting novel. He came to Carlile from Front Royal, Virginia in 1863. A poor man, not being the owner of any property, save a few personal effects and without money. The late Sterrett Woods befriended him greatly, purchasing for him an axe and giving him work cutting wood. In a comparatively short time, Mr. Thompson saved enough to purchase a horse and a wagon. Then he sold chips of wood and subsequently conducted a general draying business. The word draying refers to hauling, transportation. His next progressive move was to buy a farm northwest of town. Then he embarked in the excavation contracting business and hauling, continuing in the same until his death. Mr. Thompson possessed very meager education, not being able to read or write, but his business capability was way above the average. With an indomitable will and ceaseless energetic efforts, evidencing at times remarkable tact and foresight, he accumulated considerable real estate, his transactions generally resulting in profit. The farm that is referred to there, once again, in the northwest part of town, is what is part of that farm is what we now know as Union Cemetery. Now, Mr. Thompson Sr. was born in Front Royal, Virginia, as a slave. Front Royal, Virginia is very near Winchester, Virginia. Once again, we're seeing that funnel of enslaved peoples coming north from the Shenandoah Valley into the Cumberland Valley. Look at that for just a second while I get another drink of water, and then I'll tell you another personal anecdote. Okay, at the same time that I was looking at the photograph or the images of the Quaker Oats man and thinking that that was William Penn, I was visualizing Pennsylvania as a liberal, progressive state from the very beginning of Penn's colony. And when I got here in 2001 and started doing more research and heard more information and realized that Carlile's schools were segregated until almost the year I was born, again, I was astounded. But a lot of you know that. Some of you possibly even had family experience with Carlile's segregated school system. In 1834, the Free School Law of Pennsylvania was enacted, and that started free public schools throughout the state, not just African American schools or just white schools, but primarily white schools. There were a number of schools for African American or colored students that were started shortly thereafter, including the school in the basement of Bethel AME Church, which we are definitely going to talk about again shortly. There's a picture, so I won't forget. Also, in 1896, there was a petition, a movement that went forward here in Carlisle called the Mary E. Brown versus the Carlisle School Board. And when I first saw a reference to Brown versus School Board, I thought it was related to the 1954 legislation that went to the Supreme Court and ended segregation throughout the country. This was a local petition. And Mary E. Brown lived in Carlisle and petitioned the school board to try to secure enrollment for her son at the high school that was closest to their house. It was a white high school, and her petition was eventually denied for a number of administrative reasons. But at the same time that I was reading a paper about the Mary E. Brown versus Carlisle School Board process, I also saw information in the papers at that time that were being transcribed of earlier petitions related to the segregated schools and efforts to achieve integration within the school system, one of which was signed by R.C. Young, who is Robert C. Young that we saw on the previous slide, and John G. Butcher, who was John J. Butcher's son. So the names, once you start being aware of them, start to come up more and more often in terms of doing the research. And that's always a little thrill for me when I see a name that I recognize from someplace else. In 1919 to 1920, the local high schools were integrated. It was not until 1948 to 1949, as I already mentioned, that the elementary schools in Carlisle were integrated. And the Federal Integration Act came in 1954. This is another photograph from the 1910 directory. I want you to start looking at your upper right-hand photograph, who would be Clara M. Johnson, as I tell you just a little bit about her. Then we're going to go to Charles H. Johnson and clockwise, because I want to end with Alice B. Butcher. So, Clara M. Johnson was a graduate of the Shippensburg Normal School and a teacher in Carlisle in 1910. Charles H. Johnson was the principal of the black school in Carlisle, a graduate of Shippensburg High School and the Normal School, and had had 2 years of practical work and was giving splendid satisfaction at that time. James G. Young was a native of Carlisle, a graduate of the Carlisle High School and Cumberland Valley Normal School. In 1905, he was the first African American to play football at Cumberland Valley Normal School, which we now know as Shippensburg University. And he was Robert C. Young's son. Alice B. Butcher, I'm going to talk to you about in more detail just as soon as I read this section to you from the book. In the directory, it talks about all 4 of these teachers, and it says, "This corps of bright and intelligent teachers only need the hearty cooperation of the people and the school directors to raise the standard of the school up to that of any school in the state." Now keep in mind, when this was written, the schools were segregated. Whatever defects exist in the school life of the colored children of Carlile is not due to this excellent staff of teachers. Now, Alice B. Butcher, the upper left-hand photograph in this composite, was the daughter of John and Charlotte Butcher. She graduated from Carlisle High School and was teaching in the school system in 1910. She continued to live in the area, and her obituary appeared in the local paper in 1963. It said that she had lived here all of her life and had taught for 43 years in the Carlisle elementary schools. Now that means that she went to school in the segregated school system in Carlisle, she taught in the segregated school system of Carlisle, and she had a profound impact on a lot of students in that system. Education was very important to her family, and I'm sure she passed that level of importance, that enthusiasm for education on. It said, she was also hired in 1919 by the Civic Club in Carlisle to supervise the first colored playground at Franklin and Lincoln Streets. Now that's the corner where we know Stewart Community Center is now. And she went to Dickinson Preparatory School in addition to going to the local public schools here. And in the yearbook for the Dickinson Preparatory School, it states about Alice Butcher. This is in 1903. She attends strictly to business, would rather study than eat. I don't know how many of your yearbooks said that about you, but my yearbook certainly didn't say that about me. Now, I was talking to you early on about the fact that we had entirely too much information to do a county-wide talk about African American history. Unfortunately, even within Carlisle, we have more information than I can present to you right now about the families that we have documentation for, the schools, et cetera, et cetera. Any one of them could be a single presentation. I also want to tell you just one incredibly frustrating thing about doing the research for this presentation. And Jane Black can attest to this because she and I are in a water aerobics class at the YMCA together. And I would come in frequently and say, or she would say to me, oh, I just found out this really neat piece of information. And we would say, but we don't have time to include it now. And we were right about that. As recently as last week at this very podium, Sue Meehan mentioned that Louisa and Thomas Stanton, who were African Americans, owned a Cumberland County mill between the years of 1866 and 1876. My immediate thought was, oh, I've got to do more research about that and include them in my presentation. And then I had to step back and say, no, Sandy, you don't have time to do more research about that, even though Sue sent me the research that she had. So, stepping back once again, the Folk Key families are fascinating looks at the local community and local families. The pictures up to upper left of the screen show Jonas Key in his United States Colored Troop uniform and his wife, Mary Folk Key. I'm going to talk to you about Mary Folk first. She was born in 1843 in Virginia, and a younger brother, George, was born in Carlisle. Now, the younger brother, George, is on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll talk about him in just a minute. Mary's parents came to Carlisle from Virginia sometime in the mid-1800s. Evidence indicates that the family had been enslaved, and at least 2 children, Mary and a brother named Reuben, had been taken away from their mother before she left Virginia. Mary did eventually come to Carlisle to join her parents. She married Jonas Key, a United States Colored Troop veteran, when he was a widower and she was 25 years old. They had 6 children who would survive to adulthood. Mary and Jonas considered education to be very important for their children, like so many other families. Jonas could read and write, but Mary was illiterate. Now, if you stop and think about the fact that it was illegal to teach children of enslaved families to read and write in the Virginia of her time, it's not surprising that she was illiterate. But they were very interested in the education of their own children, and all of their children eventually learned to read and write, and they attended the segregated schools in Carlile. There is no record that Mary worked outside of the home, no record, but somehow she accumulated enough money to buy a plot of ground on Baltimore Street, and Jonas, who was a carpenter, built a house on that plot of land. They lived in that house for years. Their children lived in that house for years, and eventually one of Mary and Jonas's granddaughters lived in that house and acquired the documentation, the artifacts, the photographs, the letters that she donated to the Cumberland County Historical Society, and that became the basis for a wonderful asset here at the Historical Society about this family. So I would say to you that if you're going through your attic, or you know anybody else who's going through your attic or the home where parents lived, and you come across a stack of photographs and newspapers and letters that you don't know anything about, consider giving them to a local historical society where somebody might be able to do the research to make those kind of documents a living legacy for that family. Now, the photograph on the right of George W. Folk, Mary Folk Key's younger brother, shows him in his Grand United Order of Oddfellows uniform. This gives me a chance to just mention briefly the significance of fraternal orders within the African American community. Now that would not only be the Grand United Order of Oddfellows, that would also be Masons, that would be the Grand Army of the Republic, all sorts of fraternal organizations that for a number of years when they were first developed, when they were first founded, were segregated, like so much else in the community. Eventually became integrated and changed over time. But the fraternal orders were a wonderful support system within the African American community, just like they have been a support system within white communities over the decades too. I want to quote from the 1910 directory again, related to George Folk. It says he was an active and progressive citizen. At one time, he traveled with the New Orleans University Jubilee Singers. For several years, he has been the only colored employee at the government Indian school here. He is a property owner and conducts a restaurant and a boarding house. Further research shows that George Folk was not the only African American employee at the Carlile Indian School. However, he did travel from the train station with people and baggage to the Indian school to transport people who were arriving, or luggage or baggage and that sort of thing. He was an important employee at the Indian school, even if he wasn't the only employee. The photograph at the lower right shows Mr. Folk in a horse-drawn cart. This particular wagon is from the Bowman's department store, but it's probably similar to the kind of wagon, or possibly the wagon that he would have used to take items to the Indian school. The photograph at the lower left shows Mary and Jonas's son, who was named George Folk Key, and his family, and that's from about circa 1925, 1930. Emma Thompson McGowan. Once again, I could do an entire presentation about Emma Thompson McGowan. And if you are interested in more than I have time to tell you right now, look up the volume 21, number 2, winter of 2004 journal that is printed by the Historical Society. It's available in our library. In that journal, Sue Meehan has written an article called An Introduction of the Thomas McGowan Collection. We are extraordinarily lucky here to have a large number of items related to this family that tell us just enormous amounts of fascinating details about the family from that time period. But in a very brief way, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about Emma Thompson McGowan, who moved with her family to Carlile when she was 13 years old. Her parents were former slaves in Winchester, Virginia area. Her father was a trained carpenter. And when they came to Carlile, there were 6 children in the family. Emma was the eldest. In the next 10 years, in the next 9 years, 10 more children were born to the family, including a set of twins. So at one point in time, Emma Thompson was the eldest of a family of 16 children. This was in the day when when all of the laundry would be done by hand, all of the water would be heated over an open fire, the food and the fruits and the vegetables, a lot of would have been grown by the family, and definitely you couldn't go to your local grocery store and buy a box of cheese and mac or a container of Quaker Oats. I mean, you had to get your food in a much more rudimentary way. And Emma started working at age 9 as a nursemaid for a family, earning 50 cents a week. From the age of 9 to 21, she and all her siblings turned over all the money that they earned to their mother. At age 21, in 1897, she started paying rent to her parents. At that point in time, she was teaching at the segregated Lincoln School on North Pitt Street, and she was earning $30 a month. $24 of that monthly payment she gave to her parents. Now, at about that same time, in 1898, her father was among a group of African American citizens in Carlile who formed the Third Presbyterian Church, and that's the photograph that you see at the lower bottom of your screen, the church building. This was an effort, and I'm going to quote, to extend the Presbyterian creed among the black population of the community, unquote. The church, the newly formed Third Presbyterian Church, at that corner of Pomfret and Bedford, called Reverend Osborne Howard McGregor McGowan to be their first pastor. Osborne Howard McGregor McGowan was the first pastor of the Third Presbyterian Church. And that's the man who's pictured with the family in the lower left-hand corner. Caleb Thompson, Emma's father, was greatly impressed with the Reverend McGowan, and he persuaded his daughter Emma to marry the Reverend in 1902. Almost immediately, problems developed within the community for Reverend McGowan, and the couple moved to Buffalo, New York, shortly after their marriage. Troubles continued, and the family moved to Windsor, Ontario. By this time, there were children involved in the family and the moving as well. More problems, and the family eventually moved to Detroit, Michigan. Unfortunately, the problems within the church communities and within the family not only continued but intensified, and Emma Thompson McGowan filed for divorce, which was very unusual at that time, as you know. As she waited for the divorce to be final, she had 3 daughters and a son in Detroit. She took in laundry, she took in mending, she worked as a waitress, she did all kinds of odd jobs in order to earn money to support her family while she was waiting for her divorce. That eventually became final in 1917 in April on the grounds of extreme cruelty and non-support. Shortly after that, Emma Thompson moved back with her children to, Emma Thompson McGowan moved back to Carlile with her children, and found work in the Dickinson College serving meals and doing other odd jobs. I see a repetition there of the same kind of thing that Emma was doing when she was a young girl, and I'm guessing that maybe her children contributed their money to the family just like she had contributed the earnings that she made when she was a child. And at the same time, Emma found a teaching job again at the Lincoln School. While she was teaching full-time at the Lincoln School, she was also enrolled at the Cumberland Valley Normal School, walking to the train station every Saturday to go for classes. During the summers of 1921 and 1922, she attended full-time and got her teaching certificate in 1922. She bought property for a home adjacent to her parents' property on Franklin Street, and she retired from the teaching in Carlisle in 1943 and died in 1966. Now, I'd like for you to recall for just a moment the comment in Alice Butcher's Dickinson Preparatory School yearbook that she would rather study than eat. Emma Thompson McGowan was one of Alice Butcher's teachers. So I can see Emma Thompson McGowan having a huge impact, not only on Alice Butcher, but on dozens and dozens and dozens of other students within the Carlile segregated school system. And the fact that in 2000, the Carlile Area School District dedicated the Emma Thompson McGowan building, which you see in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, seems totally befitting to me. Just let me tell you just one more brief little bit of information about the church. In the Carlile Gazette in 1900, it said that the old German Lutheran church at the corner of Pomfret and Bedford Street has passed to the possession of the Carlile Presbytery and will hereafter be a Presbyterian colored mission. When St. Paul's Lutheran congregation built their new church, they no longer had any need of this property and sold it. Unfortunately, by 1926, the membership at Third Presbyterian was declining, and by 1927, Third Presbyterian closed its doors as an entity. The building is now, which you can still recognize if you drive past Bedford and Pomfret Street. The church tower is no longer dominating the image, but you can still recognize it. The building is now part of the County American Red Cross system. This photograph shows the Lincoln High School class of 1912. In our records, the students on this photograph are not identified. The teacher is identified as Professor J.A. Ward. If, at the end of this presentation, you can come forward and give me the identity of one or more of those students, you would just make my day. If you ever have any free time and you think you'd like to look through some of our photo archives and possibly identify some of the people who are in our photographs who are not identified, that would be wonderful too. Richard, we could certainly make use for people, volunteers like that, couldn't we? Now, these two buildings, you would also still recognize if you drove down Pomfret Street as St. Patrick's Church and St. Catherine's Hall. Stepping back again in time, I have, and I'm going to show you a picture in just a minute of St. Catherine's Colored Select School. I have never heard Catherine Drexel or any of the buildings or enterprises associated with her referred to as anything but St. Catherine. Now, I realize that I moved to Carlile in 2001. She was canonized in the Catholic Church in 2000. So any references that happened after 2001, when I got here, people would have been referring to her as St. Catherine. When these photographs were taken, and when the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament that she founded were spreading educational opportunities within the system, she was not St. Catherine. She was just Mother Catherine. If you drive by like I did after I found these photographs, unfortunately the buildings don't look nearly that pristine and new, which is kind of a shame. But then I don't look as pristine and new as I did 50 years ago either. St. Catherine's Colored Select School. If you look at the picture on the upper left, you can see the bowed stained glass windows and a statue, a religious statue there. Both of these pictures show students from the African American community who were in those classes. And like I said, I didn't give you the date. In 1907, a school for African American students was opened in Catherine's Hall, what we now think of as St. Catherine's Hall, by the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, which was a group that had been founded by Mother Catherine Drexel. This group of nuns were dedicated to the welfare and the education of two groups in our society, African Americans and Native Americans. And if you stop and think about it, this was an ideal place for them to follow through on those two goals. because they had the Carlile Indian Industrial School here in town, and they had the African American community that they could reach out to. So the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament were involved in mission groups throughout the country. But here in Carlisle, they had 2 groups that they could work with right in one town. Unfortunately, I don't have photographs of other school groups for African American students. There were other schools, there were other organizations that founded groups for the education of African American students in Carlisle. I just don't have pictures of them, and I'm sorry about that. But I do have this picture. This picture shows band members with their teachers at the Wilson School, circa 1947, 1948. I can't date it any more closely than that, but it's obviously before elementary schools were integrated, obviously. Now, I don't know who that little drum major in the very front of that slide is. But again, if any of you can tell me, and if you happen to be able to tell me if he was still alive, I would love to go up and shake his hand, because that photograph just makes me smile every time I see it. The rest of the kids are adorable, but that band major just has happiness all over his face. Okay, the Cumberland Valley State Normal School football team of 1905. The upper right-hand row, the back row, right-hand side, is James Young. Now, this is James Young that we saw the photograph as a teacher. This is James Young, who is Robert C. Young's son. This is also James Young, who was the first African-American player on the Shippensburg High School team in 1905, as you can see. In 1907, he was the starting fullback for the team. But in the last game of the season against Mercersburg Academy Reserves, the Mercersburg officials threatened to withdraw if Young played. The officials at what we now think of as Shippensburg asked Young to sit out the game, which he did. And the Cumberland Valley State Normal School team lost 10-0. This is the same James Young I mentioned to you from the other directory. He graduated in 1908 and taught elementary school in Carlisle for 39 years. So after leaving Cumberland Valley State Normal School, he taught in the local school system for 39 years. Where Lincoln Cemetery once existed, and there is now a park associated with Hope Station, and this would be at the corner of North Pitt and Penn Streets, that park area is named the Young Memorial Park, and that's in honor of James Young. Okay, John, I promised the group that I was going to talk about Charles Franklin Moss, and I'm making good on my promise. Charles Franklin Moss was an African-American photographer. He lived in Carlisle and attained fame as a photographer and an artist in the early 1900s. He was originally from, and I do not make this up, he was originally from Winchester, Virginia. He did apprenticeships in Providence and Newport, Rhode Island, and studied at the Cooper Union School of Fine Arts in New York City. He came to Carlisle and operated a photography studio on Pitt Street, and in 1914, while he was still in Carlisle, he was granted membership in the National Association of Professional Photographers, the first African American to become a member of that prestigious group. The photo, now both of these photos were taken by Charles Franklin Moss, and a number of other photos. We're very lucky to have a nice representation of his photographs in our collection. The photograph on the right is of Reverend John P. McCard baptizing a member of the church in the Letort Spring, circa 1910. Reverend McCard did these immersion-type baptisms on Easter Sundays for a number of years, so we think this one was from that Easter Sunday in 1910. The photograph on the left shows the Shiloh Baptist Sabbath School, which was founded by Reverend Peck in 1889, and very nicely, that particular photo is actually dated on the photograph. So we know that not only was that done by Moss, but that it was taken in April of 1919. April 13th, 1919. Now, talking about Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church, I have here 2 photographs of that church. The photograph on the left might not look very familiar to you because that's the small wooden structure that was built on the corner of Lincoln and North Streets after the church congregation had moved from spot to spot for a number of years. And it eventually acquired that plot of land, and this small wooden structure was built. In 1888, Reverend Dr. John Philip McCard became the pastor of Shiloh Church, and in 1911 he devised a plan to build a new church. The congregation had been growing and growing and growing, and they outgrew the small wooden structure. So Reverend McCard's plan, and he, by the way, was a bricklayer and contractor of some note within the community and at the Carlile Indian Industrial School. He was a skilled bricklayer. He recommended a unique plan of action. He suggested that the congregation build the new brick church around the existing wooden church, which is what they did. And that meant that the congregation could continue attending church services in the wooden structure as the new structure was being built, and it worked out very well for them at the time. If you would look at the bell tower on the brick structure to your right, in 1952, when the old market house was scheduled for destruction, they auctioned off a number of the items that were part of the old market house. And Mr. Sidney Spragland, who was a member of the Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church, was the high bidder for the bell that used to ring over the old market house. He donated that bell to the Shiloh Missionary Baptist Church, and for years after its dedication in 1952, it rang on special occasions in that neighborhood. This shows the West Street AME Zion Church. The photograph on the upper left-hand side shows a women's group from approximately 1910 to 1920. This is also from Charles Franklin Moss's studio. In our records, probably a third of the women in that photograph are identified. I would love for somebody to be able to identify more of them. The stone building that you see in the lower left-hand corner was on that site before the brick front was added, and the congregation moved to this site in 1883. That brick front was added in 1909. This church, like many other churches and many other places in the community, were used for multiple purposes throughout the years. It was a site of an underground railroad station. It was an infirmary during the Civil War, served as a hospital at times of distress as well. The stone building next to the church in the right-hand picture was built by Robert Thompson in 1895. Now, since you all know that there were 2 Robert Thompsons, and since you now know that they were both alive in 1895, either or both of them might have been responsible for building that stone structure. Bethel African American Episcopal Church, Bethel AME Church on Pomfret Street. In its history, it has served the community in many ways too. In 1836, a class for African American children in Carlile was organized by the Ladies' Benevolent Society as a missionary and benevolent enterprise. It was located in the basement of this church and taught by Miss Sarah Bell. Now, Miss Sarah Bell continued to teach in the Carlile schools for decades, but she started by teaching a group of African American students in the basement of this church. She included religious and secular instruction with the curriculum that she provided to the African American students. And these were African American students that went from this high all the way up to this high. Adults came in at times too. And Miss Bell provided religious instruction as well. The Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament did not include religious instruction in their curriculum because they were aware of the fact that some families within the African American community would hesitate to send their children to a school where they were going to be instructed in the Catholic catechism. but this school did have some religious instruction. The church also served as a temporary shelter and hospital during the Civil War. The bottom two pictures are the sons of Reverend John Roth, who was a man who grew up in Carlile and later became a pastor at the AME Church in Westchester, Pennsylvania. Now on the left is Ralph Elwood Brock, who was the first African-American graduate of Pennsylvania State Forest Academy in Mont Alto, and he served for many years in the State Forestry Department. On the right-hand side is John Robert Paul Brock, who was the first African-American graduate of Dickinson College in 1901. He was born in Harrisburg. His parents were John C. and Alcinda Brock. Those would have been the parents for his brother Ralph Elwood Brock as well. John Robert Paul Brock entered Dickinson College in 1897. He received his bachelor's degree in 1901, his master's degree in 1902, and interestingly, especially for me, he taught in the Carlisle school system for that year, 1901 to 1902, while he was completing his master's degree, and then he moved to Baltimore. This is my last slide. The end is in sight. This photograph shows what I think are employees at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. The information that is on the paper sleeve that covers the modern negative that was developed from a glass slide that was taken by a photograph with a glass negative. Richard, would it be a glass negative, AA line? Okay, a glass negative, a modern negative was made of it. The information on the envelope says that these are workers from the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Unfortunately, it doesn't show up very well, but if you look closely, you will see that each of the individuals in this photograph has some sort of an implement, either in his or her hands or next to him or her. The gentleman on the far right has a big metal tin that could be used for heating water or soup or whatever. The woman next to him is holding an iron, a flat iron. The woman next to her has a rolling pin. One of the gentlemen has a broom. I think, and we're going to do more research and hopefully determine this for sure, but I think those implements indicate in some way what position those workers would have had at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. But all I can tell you right now is that Jane Black and I are already doing the research that will result in the next presentation in this series, which will be about the intersection of the African American community with the Native American community here in Carlisle. A time and date is yet to be determined, but I hope you'll keep your eyes open for that presentation and come again. And right now, I just have to say thank you very much for your kind attention, and do I have any questions or comments? Yes?
Going way back, when you had that slide of the level of slaves, you had, like, when it was really low, you had a dot, 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 but then when it got to like 1850, the block was like this. Can you explain what that was?
That may have been, what it was intended to show, she was asking me a question about the slide for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery Act. What it was intended to show was that until 1840, there were still slaves in Pennsylvania. I don't know exactly why that one particular block looked bigger than the others. But my daughter, who lives in Arlington, Virginia, not Winchester, Virginia, Arlington, Virginia, put that slide together for me, so I'll ask her.
Okay. And my other question is, since it seems you already have the PowerPoint displayed, have you ever considered just doing a voiceover to the photos and like posting it online to be purchased?
I personally have not considered that. I will mention that idea to some of the people who work here. Okay. Now, the video, there might be less interest in purchasing something like that, since the video that is being taken right now is going to be available free of charge at our website.
Oh, okay.
Also, at our website, at the same area where you go to see the videos eventually, there is a bibliography, a partial bibliography of the monumental amount of research that was available to this committee. So if you go to that same website, the historicalsociety.com website, you go to the past programs section, and then you go down where it says something about Sandy Mader, and underneath that is bibliography. That's where the bibliography would be. Any other questions? Yes.
Is that where Union Cemetery is? And
Yes.
It's still.
Oh, yes, yes. In fact, okay, the question was, where is Union Cemetery? I can give you a personal story about that. I can also tell you that sometime within the last couple of years, there's been a very nice historical marker put up at that cemetery related to the fact that Robert Thompson was instrumental in developing the cemetery. It is, if you go all the way up College Street, what's the name of that fraternal organization that's right there? Okay. Okay, Franklin and G Street. Yeah, near where the public swimming pool is, right. When we lived here, when my husband was a member of the Army War College of class of 1987, that dates me, doesn't it? When we lived here in 1986 and 1987, we lived at a duplex right there near the public swimming pool, and my daughter and I used to wander around through that cemetery on a nice day, so I know very well where it is. Any other questions? Mm-hmm.